everybody, and welcome to Real Talk with Eddy Kara. Today, as winter is approaching here in Canada, we have with us Mardig Bidanian, who's a really good friend of mine for a number of years, and he's also our policy analyst. Hey Mardig, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me on today.
So it's been a pretty long break for us with the podcast, but we're glad to be returning, right? And as winter is approaching here, there's also rising costs of living. So we're turning our attention today during our episode. We are looking at Hydro-Québec, and in recent years, they have raised rates, for instance. They've rolled out energy efficiency programs, and now, controversially, they will be asking the permission to charge customers $1.40 per paper bill if they want to receive this bill on paper by mail. So the company says that the fee would help them offset rising postal costs and encourage electricity billing, generating millions in savings. However, supporters of this do argue that it will help keep electricity rates down, and others are warning. A lot of organizations actually have just publicly warned that it does punish people who do lack digital literacy, digital access, or comfort, oftentimes the most economically vulnerable folks. So let's begin with the first question. Is this a fair new policy announcement, or is it actually discriminatory? What say you, Marty?
I say that we often take the internet access for granted, like not everyone has access to the internet. I mean, here in Canada and Quebec, we are relatively well urbanized, so that means our connections are pretty good. However, there are people in the rural areas that don't really have good connections, so this can be a way to kind of bridge this digital divide in the sense because this like $1 for the bill, for this paper bill, it isn't too much. It's not too much to charge, and because like when you have the bill with you on paper form, you can actually see the costs. Because if it's digital, it kind of like goes in the back of your mind. It's easier to miss. But I guess when you have stuff on paper and when you receive them, you read the charges that you get. So in the sense that it has its ups and downs, I think that Hydro may want to offset some costs, as they say. But is it discriminatory? I mean, it could be. It could be because when people don't have internet access, they need to pay extra for this service.
Well, let's just put it like this. Instead of the word discriminatory, would this be an unfair surcharge on consumers?
It would be unfair if it was more. I mean, if it was more than $1, it would have been, I guess it has to do with the magnitude of the cost. If it was $5 more, yeah, that would hurt. But if it's like $1 of 40 cents, as you said, I mean, it's not too extortionate.
So I think it's worth looking at before we go on further with the timeline of what has happened with Hydro-Québec, who is the sole energy provider in the Quebec province in Canada. So in 2023, Hydro-Québec had major investments that were publicly announced because, according to them, the grid is aging and demand is growing pretty quickly, such as with heat pumps, data centers, and EVs. So they announced long-term plans that were quite ambitious, with tens of billions needed to upgrade the current network. And also in 2023, early on, their CEO, Sophie Brochu, did resign. And then Michael Sabia was appointed the CEO later that year. And the expectations with his leadership were pretty big because he had let Caisse de Dépôt beforehand. And then fast forward to 2024, where you had a lot of issues such as lower water levels. So we call this low hydrolicity, which means in the reservoirs, there's much less water compared to previous years. And this means that Hydro-Québec will produce much less hydroelectricity. And this also reduces the cheaper electricity that's available for us. And it also increases pressures such as on operations and profitability. And then they pushed for their big project called the Action Plan of 2035, because of aging infrastructure, more demand, and climate stress on hydropower and hydroelectricity, which require billions of dollars in upgrades. And this, of course, was also when Hydro-Quebec, using these reasons, they increased rates by 3.6%, citing inflation as the main reason, as well as heavy investment needs. Fast forward to early and mid 2025, the Régie de l'Énergie, which is the regulatory body here in Quebec, approved a 3.6% residential rate increase for this year, even though they had asked around 3%. And then there was a lot of backlash publicly, and there still is. And a lot of people said that Hydro is using us consumers as cash cows to finance their big projects, even though they had made billions in profit before the year of 2024. Lately, basically right before this paper bill controversy, we had Michael Sabia resigning. This was right after there was huge public backlash regarding the instability and a lot of questions raised, mainly by the media as well, about their strategic direction with all these ambitious plans. This was seen primarily, this major announcement, as punishing seniors and those who don't have access digitally, electronically. It's also seen as what we refer to as a nickel and diming tactic at a time where affordability crises are still occurring and, they're still making a lot of profit, Hydro-Quebec. So what would you say in terms of the timeline of the last 2 years, per se?
I think that the energy issue is a longer term issue in Quebec, as we say. I mean, because these big projects, one thing that they are vulnerable, these big infrastructure projects are vulnerable to cost overruns, and it's quite dangerous, the fact that a lot of this is falling on the consumer, right? I mean, sure, there can be cost overruns. That's always the risk for these projects. But I guess at the end of the day, who foots the bill for this, And okay, it's the bigger picture is it's not only that $1, because if you take that $1 for the paper bills, it's in isolation, it's not a big deal. But when you have this bigger picture of this bigger, longer term investment, and then secondly, where is the government or where is Hydro's own resources in this? And I guess it in the I guess also there is like a mentality issue in the sense that, okay, Hydro wants to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that, okay, you want to sell your electricity to consumers and you want them to pay for your electricity, but then you're also making them pay for your infrastructure as well. And I think that ultimately that one thing that's frustrating a lot of people in general is a mentality issue, because everyone wants to seek rent, everyone wants to pass down the cost of something onto another person without taking the responsibility for it. I mean, sure, every company and every institution can make mistakes. A lot of things are outside of the control of Hydro, right? But I think it creates a moral hazard in the sense that it shouldn't be the consumers who are already losing a lot of purchasing power over decades at this point to foot the bill.
So I'm going to jump in over here. What's your opinion about this on a practical and personal level?
I think that when these costs are falling off the consumer, it makes life more difficult than it already is.
So who do you think should pay for these ambitious projects and major changes needed to the infrastructure? Let's not forget that Hydro-Quebec, just like every other province has their own, Hydro One, for instance, in Ontario, it is a crown corporation and it is the sole energy producer in the province of Quebec, right? And they do have a monopoly for this reason. So they do have a form of partnership with the provincial and federal governments as a crown corporation, even though they like operating independently, quote unquote. And in the past, by the way, we've had many big companies who have announced. So when I think about in in the Quebec region in terms of telecommunications companies. Bell, Rogers, TELUS, Videotron, they tried charging for paper bills. And because there was heavy negative public backlash, they did back off. For Videotron, they did in the 2010s. And then, well, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, they started charging $2 to $3 per paper bill. And then the Quebec government did pressure them to get rid of this charge for seniors, low-income consumers, and those who have disabilities. In terms of Canadian organizations, I can think of cell phone companies similarly and banks. I think they still do charge for paper statements, often between $2 to $5. And then obviously in Canada, we have the Canada Radio and Television Commission who regulate this stuff in terms of telecommunications and otherwise. They did intervene and they restricted them from charging this to vulnerable customers. So overall, I'm of the opinion, and I share it with, I think, the majority of folks, this is quite predatory. I don't think this is the way to go about it because technically we have the Quebec government that already finances using our taxpayer money. So why should they keep on surcharging us if they cannot handle the brunt of their budget? And may I add that they're still making profits lower than these 2 recent years, but it's still profitable. It's not like in heavy debt like Canada Post, right?
Yeah.
So it does not make sense if they're getting their money in terms of profits and with the partnership of the ones who represent us in Quebec in the National Assembly and the Legault government, that it should actually be a policy of this nature. And, you know, the excuse that's very old now is inflation, you know? Yes, there's tariffs against us, you know, by Donald Trump mainly, but I don't think that should be the main excuse. I think it's pretty old now, given that it was in 2020 that we had that excuse that started because of COVID. Here's a follow-up question. Does charging for paper bills actually help the environment?
Going more paperless would help the environment more because you'd need to cut fewer trees. There's less of an impact on the environment and the production of paper. But overall, I think that the majority of Quebec's electricity in general is very clean. Thankfully, we have a very clean system. So the environmental impacts may be negligible.
So, funny enough, I took some time to do some research because I like putting my devil's advocate hat on, right? And I asked myself, what do I think? In theory, it does and it should reduce the environmental impacts that are quite negative, that harm us and the future generations onwards. Obviously, we reduce printing waste, how much paper we use with the lack of trees available producing, obviously, oxygen for us. And also, you don't risk having transportation emissions when there's deliveries that are being made, so to speak. But if we look at the numbers, paper bills are a very small fraction of total paper use by, let's just focus on Canadian consumers. Despite these policies being in place, especially with plastic too, government and large businesses still do mass print paper documents regardless. They don't shy away from that. In essence, if I look at the numbers, Canada only recycles 9% of all plastics that we use. And about 60 to 70% of all paper that we use. Much of this paper or plastics that are being thrown out, so to speak, or recycled, they do end up in landfill, and large volumes of this often get shipped to African or Asian countries or even some parts of the open ocean areas. Specifically, the Pacific Ocean, I'm aware of, has a huge area that we export our stuff. So only around, unfortunately, 5 to 9% of all our waste gets actually recycled properly. Claiming that it's because of paper, I don't think is a good argument to make for any organization, whether it's a crown corporation or a private corporation, because you can always renew paper, right? When it's recyclable, theoretically, of course, we don't all renew ourselves, right? You need others to do it for us in the supply chain. and it's also biodegradable. And there's much bigger, usage that are wasteful, such as the clouds that we use in terms of digital storage and smartphones. I think that's much more harmful to our environment, and
And
obviously
AI as well. Yeah.
manufacturing plants, right? Those leave a much bigger carbon footprint than just mailing a Hydro-Quebec bill by paper. So that's the segment for us in terms of the Hydro-Quebec announcement of $1.40 surcharge on paper bills. We'll be right back after this break.